The rain came down in thick, heavy sheets, drumming against the roof like a relentless army of tiny fists. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wet asphalt. The storm had knocked out the power about an hour ago, plunging the house into an eerie silence, save for the occasional rumbles of thunder that shook the walls. Sarah sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her phone screen casting a pale glow across her face. She had never liked being home alone, but tonight felt different, off. It wasn't just the storm or the darkness, it was the feeling that she wasn't really alone. She shook off the thought and turned her attention back to the movie playing on her phone, trying to ignore the occasional creak of the old house settling. But then, there it was again, a noise, soft, almost imperceptible. A shuffle? No, more like the sound of something brushing against the back door. Her heart gave a single solid thud against her ribs. She muted her phone and listened. The rain continued to pound outside, but beneath it, there was breathing. Faint, uneven, just beyond the back door. Sarah sat frozen, every muscle tensed. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe it was the wind. Then came the knock, light, deliberate, almost polite. Her breath hitched in her throat. Who the hell would be knocking in this weather? She crept toward the kitchen, where the back door stood in darkness. The faint glow of the storm outside barely illuminated the figure standing on the other side of the glass. A man, soaking wet, motionless. His face was obscured by the shadows, but he didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, waiting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, ready to call 911. Just as she unlocked the screen, a second knock came. Harder this time. She swallowed hard. Hello? Her voice came out weaker than she intended. No response. The figure didn't even shift. He just stood there, head slightly tilted. Then slowly, agonizingly slow, he lifted his hand and pressed it against the glass. His fingers were long and thin, splayed out like a spider's legs. The air in the room turned ice cold. Sarah took a step back. I'm calling the police, she stammered. Finally, he moved. Not away from the door, but downward. He crouched low, still staring. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze burning through the glass. Her phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the tile. The second it hit the floor, the man bolted. Not away, but sideways, around the house. She barely had time to react before she heard it, a sharp, quick tap on the front window. Sarah whirled around, her pulse hammering in her ears. He was there. Somehow, impossibly fast, he had reached the living room window. His hand, still pressed against the glass, dragged downward, leaving a streak of moisture. She grabbed her phone and ran, her legs barely supporting her as she stumbled toward the stairs. She didn't know where to go, what to do. Her hands were shaking too much to dial. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of the front door unlocking. Not forced open, not kicked in, unlocked. She never heard him come in. The last thing she heard, before the lights flickered back on, was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps ascending the stairs.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the trees, sending twisted shadows across the darkened street. It was nearly midnight, and Sophie was alone in her house. She had grown used to being by herself after her parents had moved away, leaving her to handle the old house they had bought years ago. A sense of familiarity surrounded her, but tonight, something felt off. It wasn't the storm, or the occasional flickering of the lights, or even the creaking of the floorboards. No, it was the silence, unnatural, suffocating. Sophie sat in her living room, trying to focus on the book in her hands, but her eyes kept drifting to the hallway. It wasn't the first time she'd felt like she was being watched, but tonight, the sensation was stronger. She shook it off as nerves, blaming the storm. A sudden bang echoed from upstairs, loud enough to make her jump. Sophie froze, heart hammering in her chest. She waited for any sound to follow, any sign that it was just the house settling, but nothing came. She waited for another minute, then stood up, the wooden floor creaking beneath her. Her hand trembled as she gripped the banister, hesitating at the foot of the stairs. The air was unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that made her breath catch in the back of her throat. With each step, the house seemed to grow quieter. When she reached the top, she turned down the hallway toward her bedroom. The door was ajar, just enough to let her see the darkened interior. A strange feeling crawled up her spine, and she didn't know why. It was then she heard it. Whispers, soft, indistinct, coming from within the room. Sophie swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She stepped closer, then stopped dead. In the reflection of the bedroom mirror, she saw someone standing behind her, just out of her direct line of sight. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure wasn't there when she turned around. Sophie's heart was pounding as she slowly backed away from the room, only to stop when she reached the top of the stairs. The whispering grew louder, and she could hear soft footsteps behind her, not just in the hallway, but coming from the steps below. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The temperature dropped, and Sophie felt something cold brush against her neck. Slowly, she turned, her body frozen in terror. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, with his head tilted at an unnatural angle, was a man. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and blotchy. His mouth, twisted into a grin that looked far too wide, parted. But instead of words, a low guttural growl escaped, vibrating the air. Sophie stumbled back, heart racing, as the man's head shifted unnaturally, tilting further. She turned to run, but the sound of heavy footsteps behind her made her freeze. A voice, a whisper this time, crept into her ear. "You shouldn't have come back." The room seemed to close in around her. She turned to face the figure again, but it was gone. The house was silent, the storm outside now just a distant rumble. Sophie breathed a sigh of relief, but as she began to walk toward the door, she saw something on the floor. A single footprint, barefoot, wet, and it led straight to her bed.
Story number 3.
It was late in the evening when Emily's parents left for their anniversary dinner. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windows, making the night feel even more oppressive. The house felt unusually quiet, even though she was used to being alone. Her parents had always trusted her to stay home, but something about tonight felt different. She tried to ignore it, brushing it off as just another evening in her usual routine. Emily was sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when the power flickered and went out. The sudden darkness made her heart skip a beat. It wasn't like the usual power outages. This one was deeper, more unsettling. Her phone was the only source of light, but the flicker of the screen barely cut through the suffocating darkness. She turned on the flashlight app and stood up to grab a candle. The house felt too empty, almost suffocating. She reached the kitchen and flicked the switch. Nothing. The lights didn't come back on. "Great," she muttered to herself, moving toward the living room to grab a candle from the shelf. The silence was almost unbearable now, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. As she walked back toward the hallway, she froze in her tracks. A soft knock echoed from the back door. Knock! Knock! She squinted through the darkness, but saw nothing through the window. No one could be outside, not in this weather. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky despite herself. No response. She slowly backed away, but the knock came again, more urgent this time. Emily's pulse raced. She didn't move, didn't breathe, her eyes fixed on the door. The knock came again, but this time the sound wasn't coming from the door. It was from the back of the house, the hallway leading to the rooms. A soft tap, like fingers lightly drumming on the walls. Her breath caught in her throat. No one was supposed to be here. No one was supposed to be inside. Before she could react, the sound moved closer. The soft footfalls echoed through the hallway, each step slower and heavier than the last. Emily felt the air grow cold, frigid, as if something was drawing closer, suffocating the very space she occupied. A shadow flickered in the corner of her vision. She spun around to find nothing but empty darkness. The footsteps were closer now, right outside the living room. "Mom? Dad?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, the words trembling on her lips. Then, from the shadows emerged a figure, a tall, gaunt figure with a long, bony hand pressed against the doorframe. Its face was obscured, but she could see the outline of its eyes, glowing faintly, like distant, hungry stars. Its mouth was stretched into a wide, empty grin. Emily's heart stopped. It moved slowly toward her, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. She stepped backward, but the figure reached out with its long fingers, grabbing her wrist in an icy, unyielding grip. The room seemed to close in around her, and she could feel her heartbeat pulsing in her ears as the figure's voice whispered, "You should never have been alone." With a scream, Emily yanked her wrist free and ran toward the front door, only to stop dead in her tracks. There, Standing between her and the door was another figure, equally as tall, its eyes glowing red now, a twisted grin spreading across its face. There was no escape. She turned toward the stairs, only to hear the scraping sound of its nails dragging across the floor behind her, closing in with every step. She didn't dare look back. As she reached the top of the stairs, the lights suddenly flickered back on, bright, blindingly so. But she found herself not in her house anymore. The walls were crumbling, the floors decayed, and the door at the end of the hallway stood wide open, inviting her to walk forward. Behind her, a low voice whispered, "We're always here." Emily's scream was drowned out by the sound of the thunder.
Story number 4.
The night was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to smother everything in its path. Lucas sat alone in the dimly lit living room of his grandmother's old house, staring at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight, and his parents had left hours ago. They had warned him not to stay up too late, but Lucas didn't mind. He loved the quiet, the eerie stillness that came with being the only one awake in the massive, ancient house. The house creaked as if it had a life of its own, settling in its age. The only sound, aside from the wind whistling through the cracks in the old windows, was the ticking of the clock. Lucas tried to focus on his game, but his eyes kept darting to the staircase in the corner of the room. It was something about the way the staircase seemed to loom in the darkness, its twisted steps disappearing into shadows. He had always found it unsettling, but tonight the feeling was different, more pressing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The silence was broken by a soft sound, footsteps, slow, deliberate steps from upstairs. Lucas froze. No one else was home. He stood up slowly, his breath caught in his chest. The sound of the footsteps continued, coming closer, but no one was visible. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it hard to breathe. "Mom? Dad?" His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes glued to the stairs. The footsteps reached the top of the staircase, and then nothing. For a moment there was complete silence. Then from the darkness above, a soft, low voice called out his name. Lucas. His blood turned to ice. That wasn't his parents. The voice was too soft, too strained. He felt his heart hammering in his chest as the footsteps began again. This time they weren't slow or deliberate. They were fast, erratic, and they were coming down the stairs. Lucas rushed toward the door, but as he touched the handle, it twisted, as if someone on the other side was pulling it open. He yanked it back, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. He turned around just as the figure reached the bottom of the stairs. It was a man, tall and emaciated, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to stare right through him. A twisted, jagged grin spread across his face as he reached out a bony hand. "Come play with me, Lucas," the figure rasped, its voice like nails scraping across glass. Lucas stumbled backward, terror flooding his veins. He ran toward the back door, but as his fingers touched the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. The figure was behind him now, standing just inches away. "Don't run," it whispered, its breath icy against his neck. "You can't escape." Desperately, Lucas turned to face the creature, his mind racing for a way out, but the figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the dark shadows of the room. He spun in place, heart thudding, but there was nothing there. The door creaked open. Slowly, cautiously, Lucas stepped outside. The fog had thickened, swallowing the yard whole. He felt the chill seep into his bones as he ventured into the garden. His breath came out in clouds, but he didn't dare turn back. Then, just as he reached the far edge of the garden, the whispering started again. "Come back inside, Lucas." His blood ran cold as he heard the voice not from the garden, but from the house, right behind him. He whipped around but saw only darkness. The fog was closing in, and the house, once so familiar, seemed to stretch impossibly tall in the distance. Before he could take another step, he heard a voice again, louder this time, closer. "We're waiting for you, Lucas." It was no longer a whisper. It was a scream.
Story number 5.
It was well past midnight when Mia finally returned home from her late shift at the diner. The streets were empty. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. Her apartment was quiet, too quiet, even for the night. As she fumbled with her keys at the door, a strange sense of unease crept over her. She chalked it up to exhaustion. The night had been long, and she just wanted to crawl into bed. She entered the apartment and locked the door behind her. The lights flickered once, then steadied. A sigh of relief escaped her lips as she walked into the kitchen to grab some water. It was then that she noticed something odd. Her phone, which she had left on the counter that morning, was now sitting on the kitchen table, screen cracked. She hadn't touched it all day. Her stomach tightened. She picked it up cautiously, feeling a coldness radiating from the screen. There was no new notification, no message, just an image, a picture she didn't recognize. It was a photo of her apartment, taken from the corner of her bedroom facing the door. Mia's heart started to race. The photo was taken from the exact spot where she stood now, but the picture was dated several hours ago. A chill ran down her spine. She checked the phone's gallery, but the photo wasn't saved there. It had just appeared. Before she could process what was happening, a noise came from the hallway. It was soft but unmistakable, a door creaking. Mia froze, her hand still gripping the phone. It came from her bedroom. Her pulse quickened as she slowly made her way down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under her feet. The light above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally. As she reached the door to her bedroom, she hesitated, staring at the dark crack between the door and the frame. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but clear, whispering her name from inside. Mia, her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who it was, but it sounded like her own voice, distorted, hollow. Slowly, she pushed open the door, her heart hammering. The room was dark, the bed untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet the whisper came again, this time louder, as if it were standing right next to her ear. Mia, come inside. A cold gust of air rushed past her, and the door slammed shut with a force that made the walls rattle. Mia spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she reached for the doorknob, the room grew colder still, like the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in an instant. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, Mia was no longer alone. Standing in the corner of her room was a figure, a tall, thin silhouette, draped in a black cloak. Its face was covered by a mask of smooth, featureless white. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's head tilted slightly, its eyes hidden beneath the mask, but Mia could feel them watching her, studying her. The temperature dropped further, the cold seeping into her skin, her bones. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew heavier, as though the very room was pressing in on her. A voice, not her own, came from the figure. You never should have come home, Mia. Mia staggered back, feeling an icy hand grip her wrist. She tried to pull away, but the hand was unyielding, like stone. Her skin prickled with fear, and she managed to break free just as the figure let out a low, guttural laugh. She bolted for the door, but it was locked. She twisted the handle in desperation, her mind racing. Her breath came out in frantic bursts as the room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the air thick with malevolent energy. The figure took another step forward, its silent presence filling the space. With all the strength she had left, Mia kicked the door, the force of it sending it crashing open. She ran down the hall, not daring to look back, her chest tight with terror. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, but when she reached for the handle, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Mia, it whispered. Her legs gave out beneath her as she collapsed to the floor, the door slamming shut behind her. The last thing she saw was the blank, featureless mask staring down at her as darkness took over. And in the distance, a voice echoed, cold and distant. You're never leaving.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other's name, where the streets were always empty after dark, and the houses stood silently beneath a sky full of stars. Clara had just moved into the house on the corner, eager to start fresh after a difficult year. The place was cozy, but there was something about it that made her feel uneasy. Still, she ignored it. She figured it was just the stress of the move. The first night she spent there, she kept hearing noises from the attic. Soft tapping sounds, like something or someone was up there, scratching against the floorboards. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling. After all, it was old, and old houses creaked and groaned. But the sounds kept getting louder, more insistent, as if whatever was up there was trying to get her attention. She decided to investigate. After all, it couldn't hurt, right? Clara grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the attic stairs. The air was thick with dust, and the wood groaned under her weight as she climbed. The moment she opened the attic door, the noise stopped. Everything was eerily quiet. She swept the beam of the flashlight across the room, looking for anything that could explain the noise. There was nothing unusual, just boxes covered in old sheets and piles of forgotten things. Yet as her light flickered over one of the boxes, she noticed something odd. A single set of small, muddy footprints leading across the floor. Her heart began to race. She was certain the attic had been empty when she moved in. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut, and the temperature in the attic dropped so quickly that she could see her breath fog in the air. She spun around, shining the flashlight frantically, but there was nothing there. The footsteps hadn't come from her. They had come from somewhere else. Clara tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she heard something breathing behind her. Deep, ragged breaths, like a heavy presence was right there, just out of sight. She could feel it, creeping up behind her, its breath cold against her neck. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw a figure, a small child, standing in the far corner of the attic, staring at her. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, watching her. Its face was pale, gaunt, and the eyes were too wide, too vacant. Who are you?" Clara's voice trembled as she backed toward the door. The child didn't answer, but Clara could hear something else, soft whispers murmuring in the darkness. She couldn't make out the words, but they sounded familiar, like something she had heard before, deep in her childhood. Suddenly, the child's head jerked toward her, its mouth stretching into a twisted, unnatural grin. It began to crawl toward her, its limbs bending in impossible angles, jerking with each movement. Clara screamed, her chest tightening with fear, as she turned and ran toward the door. Her hands were shaking as she pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't move. The child was getting closer now, crawling faster than she could run. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, until they felt like they were echoing inside her skull. In one last desperate attempt, Clara threw her shoulder against the door. It burst open, and she stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. She slammed the door behind her, heart racing, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed her down the stairs, down the hallway, and into the living room. Clara tried to shake them off, but they kept getting louder, clearer, as if they were coming from all directions. It wasn't until she glanced into the hallway mirror that she saw the reflection. The child, still with that twisted grin, was standing right behind her. And worse, there were others. Dozens of them, crawling in the shadows, their eyes wide and empty, watching her. Clara backed away, her breath ragged, but as she turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a violent crash. The whispers grew louder until they felt like they were drowning her, suffocating her. She could feel them closing in, those cold skeletal hands creeping closer to her, their claws brushing against her skin. And then the mirror cracked. A voice, deep and malevolent, whispered in her ear, "Welcome home."
Story number 7.
The wind howled outside, shaking the windows of the small cabin. Sarah had never been more thankful to be in a warm, cozy place on such a stormy night. The cabin, isolated in the woods, had been her getaway from the chaos of life, until now. As the storm raged outside, she settled into the old armchair by the fire with a book, trying to forget the strange things that had been happening since her arrival. At first, it was nothing more than odd feelings, like someone was watching her when she was alone in the cabin. But then the noises started, soft at first, whispers. At first, she told herself it was just the wind or the house settling. But then she began to hear footsteps, light, shuffling footsteps, moving from room to room when no one was there. The worst part was that they always seemed to be just behind her, never in front of her, never making themselves known. They followed her everywhere she went. Tonight, the storm had gotten worse, and Sarah had been holed up inside all day. The power flickered a few times, but it held, much to her relief. But then, as the night wore on, she heard the footsteps again. This time, louder and clearer. They were coming from the hallway, outside the living room door. She held her breath, straining her ears. There was no one there. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered to herself, but the uneasy feeling crawled up her spine again. She got up from her chair, walking to the door. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but the hallway was silent. She was about to close the door when something caught her eye, a shape just at the edge of her vision. A figure standing in the hallway. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure was small, its back to her. It was childlike in shape, but its movements were stiff, jerky, as though it couldn't quite remember how to walk properly. "Hello?" Sarah's voice shook as she called out into the darkness. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge her presence. It just stood there, motionless. A chill ran through her, colder than the storm outside. She took a step closer, her heart racing, and then, as if it sensed her movement, it twisted around. Its face, Sarah recoiled in horror. The eyes were empty sockets, nothing but darkness. The skin was pale, gray, stretched tight across the skull. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, like a cavern. It screamed, a sound so shrill and deafening it made her ears ring. But the scream didn't come from the figure's mouth. It came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was a noise that seemed to come from the very soul of the house. Sarah turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room spun around her, and the whispers from earlier returned, louder now, mixing with the wailing of the creature. She tried to escape through the back door, but it was locked. Panicked, she turned back toward the figure, only to find that it had moved closer, its limbs twitching, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Suddenly, it was no longer just one figure. The hallway was filled with them. Creatures, all with hollow eyes and twisted, gaunt faces, their mouths stretched into grotesque, silent grins. They were closing in, their broken footsteps scraping against the floor, surrounding her. Sarah backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She ran to the window, desperate to escape, but the glass was thick with frost, and it wouldn't budge. The creatures moved closer, their eyes locked onto her, the whispers growing louder, surrounding her, until the sound was all she could hear. She screamed, but no sound came out. In that moment, she understood. The creatures weren't here to harm her. No, they were here to keep her. And as the last whisper filled her mind, "You will never leave," the darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. When the storm passed, the cabin was silent once more. But there was one new sound in the stillness, the soft, shuffling footsteps echoing from the hall, as if something or someone was waiting to greet the next visitor.
Story number 8.
The rain came down in sheets, lashing against the windows of Jack's apartment as he sat alone in the dark, trying to ignore the unease crawling up his spine. He'd just moved into this building a week ago, and while it was cheap, he had an unsettling feeling about the place. He'd noticed strange things since the day he arrived: flickering lights, strange creaks in the walls, and odd, distant sounds like someone walking through the halls when no one was supposed to be there. At first, he blamed the old pipes, the building settling under the storm. But tonight, it felt different. It started when he heard the knock at the door. One knock, soft but clear, coming from the hallway. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was well after midnight. No one should be visiting him at this hour. Cautiously, he stood up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. No one. He frowned and opened the door, stepping into the hallway. The dim lights flickered above, casting long shadows against the walls. He looked left, then right. Empty. But the door across from his apartment was wide open, and inside, the faintest movement caught his eye. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice trembling slightly. He stepped toward the door, but no one answered. The apartment was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The only movement was the curtain swaying slightly, as though a breeze were passing through, but there were no open windows. Just the door, wide and beckoning. His curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside. The apartment was cluttered, with old furniture and dusty surfaces. It looked like no one had lived there for years, but there were fresh footprints on the floor, wet from the rain outside. His heart began to race as he scanned the room, his eyes falling on something that made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, there was a large antique mirror. The glass was cracked, and in the reflection, Jack could see a figure standing just behind him, barely visible, a silhouette in the dim light. Jack spun around, but the room was empty. He backed away slowly, heart pounding in his chest. That was when he heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo through the apartment. But it wasn't the sound of his own footsteps. These were different, heavier, dragging across the floor. The sound was coming from behind him, from the hallway, drawing closer. Jack bolted toward the door, his breath coming in sharp gasps. But as he reached for the knob, it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through him, his mind racing for a way out. He tried the window, locked. The apartment felt like it was closing in on him, the walls seemingly pressing together, the air thick with something suffocating. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. And then Jack heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering from the darkness behind him. "You should never have come inside." His body froze as the voice came closer. Slowly he turned around, his pulse hammering in his ears. The figure from the mirror was standing at the far end of the room now, its face obscured in shadows, but he could make out the shape of long, thin arms that reached out toward him, fingers bending in unnatural angles. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said, its tone cold and hollow. Jack couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of stone. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, the chilling presence creeping closer. The figure stepped forward, and Jack felt a wave of icy cold wash over him, like the temperature had dropped below freezing. He tried to scream again, but no sound came out. "Welcome to your new home," the voice whispered, just inches from his ear. And then the figure lunged. The last thing Jack felt was a cold, sharp pressure against his chest before everything went black. The next morning, the rain had stopped and the sun was shining through the windows. The building was quiet, as it always was, but if anyone had walked past apartment 3B, they would have noticed the door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from within. But no one ever did.
Story number 9.
It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seems to fade into a distant, almost unreachable memory. Sam had just moved into a new house on the edge of town, an old 2-story place that was both charming and unsettling in its isolation. The previous owners had left quickly, and the realtor had been vague about why. Sam didn't ask too many questions, excited to start fresh in a home of his own. The first few nights were peaceful. It was quiet, serene, and everything felt perfect, until the third night. That was when it started. It was around midnight when Sam first heard it, a soft, scratching sound from upstairs, like something dragging against the floor. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling, but it persisted. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate. His curiosity got the better of him, and he climbed the stairs to investigate. The hall upstairs was dark, the only light coming from the dim lamp at the end of the corridor. Sam stepped cautiously down the hall toward the bedroom at the far end. The scratching sound was clearer now, coming from inside the room. He reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, the sound abruptly stopped. His heart raced as he hesitated. Something felt wrong. The room beyond the door was still, the air unnaturally cold. Sam opened the door, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The room was empty. Nothing unusual. The only thing that seemed out of place was the window, cracked open just a fraction. He closed it, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling in his gut. Maybe it was just an animal outside. That had to be it, right? As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of something in the mirror across the room. A shadow, fleeting and quick, but unmistakable. It was behind him, tall, thin, and gaunt. His breath caught in his throat as he whipped around, but the room was still empty. His heart hammered in his chest, but he convinced himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He left the room, locking the door behind him. But as he descended the stairs, he heard something else. A faint, raspy voice, so quiet he wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but it seemed to come from somewhere inside the walls. "Sam!" He froze. His name whispered softly, as though from the shadows themselves. His pulse thundered in his ears, and panic began to rise. He tried to rationalize it. It was the wind, the house settling, his imagination running wild, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Sam, I'm here." Terrified now, he rushed to the living room, flicking on the lights, hoping to chase away the creeping dread. But as he sat on the couch, his eyes darted nervously to the window. The view was nothing but darkness, the faint outline of the trees swaying in the wind. Yet, Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. Just a shadow, but it was enough to make him jump. He quickly stood up, walking to the window, heart racing. There was nothing out there, nothing but the endless night. As he turned to sit back down, the whispering returned. It was louder now, clearer, as if it were coming from behind him. "Sam, look!" His head snapped toward the mirror above the fireplace. His reflection was there, but it wasn't just him. The figure from the upstairs room was standing behind him, its thin, elongated fingers pressed against the glass, its hollow eyes staring straight at him. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and as it did, the reflection of Sam began to distort. His own face warped into a grotesque, inhuman expression, twisting in agony. In a flash of panic, Sam rushed toward the door, but the house seemed to stretch, the hallway elongating, the rooms shifting as if the house itself were alive. The front door that had been only steps away seemed impossibly far now. The voice grew louder, the whispering turning into harsh, guttural laughter. "You should have left," it jeered. "It's too late now." Sam stumbled backward, tripping over the rug. As he fell, his hand landed on something cold, a piece of glass, broken and jagged. His mind swirled in terror, unable to think, unable to focus. He turned toward the door, and that's when he saw it. The figure was standing there, in the hallway, its long fingers dragging against the walls as it came closer. The house creaked, the walls groaning as if they were closing in. The lights flickered and went out. The last thing Sam heard before everything went black was the sound of the figure whispering, right in his ear, "I'm never leaving."
Story number 10.
It was a cold autumn evening when Lucy decided to take a walk through the woods near her new home. The forest, with its towering trees and thick underbrush, had always fascinated her, but there was something about it tonight that felt different, darker. The wind whispered through the branches above, carrying with it a strange, almost unidentifiable scent, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the path. She had always been a fan of nature, so when she first moved into the house on the edge of the woods, she was excited. It was peaceful, isolated, perfect for someone who loved the quiet. But tonight, as she walked deeper into the woods, her instincts were on edge. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, and the sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, had faded. All that remained was an unnatural silence. As she ventured further, she noticed something strange in the distance. A dim light flickered between the trees. Lucy's curiosity got the better of her, and she moved toward it. The light was faint, almost as if it were a candle or lantern, but there was no fire in sight. The glow seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the moonlight. Her heart began to race, but she couldn't stop herself from getting closer. Her feet moved almost of their own accord, pulling her toward the light. As she reached the source, she froze in horror. It was a figure standing perfectly still just inside a small clearing. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the long shadows, but it was unmistakable. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. Its body was unnaturally bent, its limbs twisted at odd angles, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. Its eyes, Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Its eyes were black, empty, soulless voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. She should have turned and run, but something in her held her in place, frozen with fear. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to hum, as if it was alive in some way. Then the figure raised its arm, slowly pointing directly at her. Lucy's heart stopped in her chest. A voice, cold and whispering, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill straight through her. Lucy turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the forest floor, but the woods seemed to shift. The trees closed in, their branches grabbing at her, blocking her way. No matter which direction she ran, the path seemed to twist and change. She couldn't find her way out. The whispering voice followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "Leave, or you'll stay forever." Suddenly she stumbled and fell, the earth beneath her giving way as if the ground itself were alive. She crashed into the dirt, her hands scraping against the rough surface. When she tried to stand, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The figure was standing in front of her now, its face inches from hers, its black eyes locked onto hers, empty and unblinking. Its mouth opened slowly, revealing teeth, long, jagged, and sharp. Lucy tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move, frozen in place by terror. The figure leaned in, its breath cold and rancid against her skin, and whispered, "It's too late. You'll never leave." As the words sank in, the world around her began to blur. The trees, the shadows, the figure, all seemed to merge together in a whirl of darkness. The last thing Lucy saw before everything went black was the figure's grin, wide and twisted, as the forest swallowed her whole. The next morning, the sun rose over the woods, casting a peaceful glow on the clearing. There were no signs of Lucy, no footprints, no trace of her ever having been there. But if you listened closely, you might hear a whisper carried on the wind. "I told you not to come."